Welcome to How Ecology Works. In this podcast, we cover all topics in ecology and how you might apply them in your future career. All right, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to How Ecology Works. Today, I'm here with Dr. Emilio Bruna, who is a plant ecologist and is really interested in biodiversity in tropical rainforests. And today he's going to talk about how fragmentation affects that system and biodiversity as a whole.
Hey, Marcus. So thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here, and this is a great opportunity to tell anybody who's interested about the kinds of ecosystems that I've been incredibly passionate about, really, as long as I can remember. I spent some of my formative years in Venezuela as a little kid, and that's really that time that I spent in Venezuela as a kid was right around the time when kids are outside grabbing bugs and frogs and snakes, and they're really into that stuff. Every kid goes through a bug phase, and mine happened to be in a city in the middle of the tropics, and that really helped a lot, I think, and set in me that this is what I want to do. I've never wanted to do anything else in my life. I can't imagine what I'd be doing if I wasn't doing what I'm doing now.
Yeah, so, I'm the same way. I don't think that grabbing bugs and frogs phase ever left me either. So
yeah, it really doesn't, and it's great. You can get paid for it now, which is really cool. So and I've always wanted to work in tropical ecosystems, and I've because of family and where I'm from, where my family's from, kind of cultural connections. I've always been interested in working in the tropics in Latin America. How I ended up in Brazil is kind of a just luck. It was really just luck more than anything else. But I ended up working in the Brazilian Amazon. That's where I've been working since the late 1990s. So a little over 20 years now that I've been working in the Brazilian Amazon primarily. It's just a phenomenal place to go. It's a dream for a biologist to get to wake up and realize that you're in the middle of Amazonian lowland tropical forest, on the just a short drive from the Amazon River, and it's a dream come true. And so the thing that really motivated me to work is right around the time that I was getting ready to go to graduate school. By now, people were starting to realize that deforestation, first of all, had been proceeding at some really scary rates. I mean, we were clearing rainforest like crazy. This isn't a new story. You've been hearing about the clearing of the rainforest for a really long time. But one of the things that people had started to identify about 5 to 10 years before is that when you clear a piece of habitat like rainforest, you don't just leave the ground completely bare. Usually you leave behind some fragments of forest, some patches of rainforest or of original habitat, if you're not in a rainforest, that are of different sizes. So and these different patches of forest can vary in size, and some of them are more isolated from each other. Usually they're surrounded by whatever habitat is there, or whatever people were trying to do with the land afterwards. So it could be cattle pastures or agriculture. In some cases, it's buildings, right? I mean, you're clearing rainforest and you build a city and you leave behind a patch of rainforest in the middle of the city. And so there was a real interest in trying to understand what happens to the plants and animals that remain behind on these kind of islands of forest that are embedded in this really different habitat. And in particular, people borrowed the ideas from another group of ecologists who study islands. And the idea being that patch of rainforest that's left behind after deforestation is like an island in the ocean. It's surrounded by some really different environment, often really inhospitable environment to the species that live there. And although you're less isolated, I mean, in theory, birds could in theory fly across that cattle pasture to get to another patch of rainforest. In tropical ecosystems, it's not quite that simple. And that's because in something that comes as a bit of a surprise to people, tropical rainforests, most people think when you go to the tropics, it's hot and it's steamy and, the sun is beating down on you, and all of that is true, but people forget that you have this rainforest canopy. It's a buffer over you.
Mm-hmm.
Rainforests are dark. Over 99% of the light that hits the rainforest canopy gets filtered out. It doesn't make it to the forest floor.
Mm-hmm.
So rainforests are dark, and they're cool, and they're humid. And when you ice, the species that evolved under these conditions, they do best in dark, cool rainforest environments. They're not really good at places that are hot and dry, like cattle pastures. Behaviorally, they freak out when you have open environments. And so the feeling was that what you've done is you've isolated populations of plants and animals in these rainforest fragments, and they can't find other ones to reproduce with. Their behavior will be completely altered, and eventually you're potentially looking at some extinction in these forest fragments that are left behind after deforestation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was really interested in studying interactions between plants and animals, in particular pollination between plants and animals, and how that might be altered by the process of habitat fragmentation, of isolating these patches of forest, and then what the long-term consequences were of any declines in pollination and the resulting production of fruits, and maybe how it affected the dispersal of seeds and the germination of those seeds, and how that would influence long time the population sizes of plants.
Mm-hmm.
The expectation is pretty straightforward, right? You figure if you're in an isolated rainforest fragment, maybe there are going to be fewer, hummingbirds there to pollinate your flowers, or there are going to be fewer hummingbirds that can move across from another patch to pollinate your flowers. That means you're going to have fewer fruits that are produced. And if you have fewer fruits, then there are going to be fewer seeds for seed dispersers to disperse. And if you have fewer seeds, it means you're going to have fewer, juvenile plants. And eventually over time, that could lead to lower and lower and lower and lower population sizes, and eventually extinction. And that was the idea that was out there in the literature. And that was what I set out to test, was whether habitat fragmentation led to population extinction potentially over time as a result of decreases in reproduction due to the disruption of these really important mutualisms.
That's interesting. It brings up a few questions that I guess I can ask you together, and then maybe you can address them. One, I'm curious how well those islands function in comparison, or how well do they conform to the traditional island biogeography theory that was with actual islands and ocean. And two, it sounds like it's really interesting what you were studying. One, it seems like there are direct effects of the deforestation, obviously removing habitat or changing the conditions, but there also could be indirect effects by changing interactions. And those changes might be fairly quick for some species, but maybe some of the longer lived plant species in particular, those effects may be delayed for even decades in some cases.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is, how useful is this analogy of rainforest islands being like oceanic islands? And it's useful to an extent, right? So one of the things that people learn pretty quickly is that in a lot of cases, forest will grow back, right? And in fact, at this point, about 40% of tropical rainforests are actually forests that are in different states of regeneration because they've been cleared at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's a long history of humans manipulating these forests, right?
Sure.
If you fly over the Amazon and you look down and you think, look at this, it's a pristine rainforest, I'll immediately correct you, because I never use the word pristine anymore. If you dig down a little bit in those forests, you'll come across a charcoal layer from where it was burned to the ground by Amerindians who were, manipulating the forest to produce more fruit, and you'll find pottery, all kinds of stuff. So there's a long history of human occupation and manipulation of these forests, but nothing like what we're seeing now, where you get the absolute, clearing. But forest will grow back. Now, the way it grows back will depend on what's done to the land afterwards. So if you clear the forest and burn it to put cattle pasture in, grasses, and then you abandon it, it'll grow back as one type of secondary forest. If you cut the trees down, but you're not able to burn, which is what cattle ranchers prefer to do, if you're not able to burn, well, then that'll grow back as a different kind of secondary forest. So there are all kinds of changes. First of all, you don't see the ocean rising up and growing up around those oceanic islands, right? I mean, ocean is going to be ocean. And so those species, those islands are going to be isolated. Whereas the degree to which rainforest islands, habitat islands, are isolated changes over time. And that means, yeah, the animals and plants can move back and forth sometimes through this secondary growth that is more or less permeable depending on what it is. So it's a useful analogy as a starting point, but it's an imperfect analogy. And we've actually learned a lot about deforestation and the regeneration of forests and how these forest fragments, the key role of the landscape they're embedded in. We never think anymore about habitat fragmentation and those fragments in isolation. We always think about the broader context. What are they surrounded by? How far away are they from another fragment? How many fragments are around them? You've really got to take a landscape perspective. And the second question was about this notion that some effects can be really fast and some can be delayed. Absolutely. You see some things immediately. If you clear a forest, you're going to see the mortality of trees along the edge of the forest that was left behind. That's because when you deforest, you suddenly allow all that light to come in, and the heat, the humidity goes down, and you stress out these trees, which are used to very narrow thermal niches that they can kind of occupy. And so you see lots of trees just die. Conditions get too hot and too dry for them. So they'll die on the edges of fragments. You'll see that stuff really quickly. You'll see, actually, initially, one of the things you see really quickly when you deforest a fragment is that bird populations go way, way up. You get a huge increase in the number of, in the abundance of birds in rainforest fragments. And that's because all the birds that were in the surrounding forest suddenly crowd into everything that's left. But then over time, you suddenly see this decline, this collapse as they start competing for resources. A lot of these birds and mammals, other kinds of things are going to be territorial. So you have all this stuff sorting out. And then eventually it goes down. And what we talk about is this extinction debt, it's called, which is that you may see a bunch of species in a rainforest fragment or a fragment of habitat somewhere else today, but those are what often what Dan Jansen used to call the living dead. If what we do is we focus on the number of species, and you have a mahogany tree in your rainforest fragment, that's a species, right? You can check that one off the list. But if there's only one of those trees, you're not going to have any mahogany trees down the road without pollen transfer and seed transfer. So when that mahogany tree goes, you're going to lose that species from that fragment. It's going to happen eventually. Hasn't happened yet. So we call that the extinction debt. You're just waiting for the living dead, right? They're eventually going to leave. And this is a huge problem, right? Across, I think sometimes people don't realize the kind of scale at which we're talking. I mean, so rainforests, occupy somewhere between, let's call it 7 to 10% of the surface area of the earth, but they have 50% or more of the species that certainly the ones that we've already, put scientific names to and are sitting in museum collections. It's probably way higher when we start to dive into things like fungi and certainly microbial diversity or viruses, all kinds of stuff like that. So it's a, small, relatively speaking, amount of the land's surface area, but a huge, huge proportion of the species. And some of these tropical rainforests are huge. The Amazon basin, right, which includes parts of 7 different countries, is roughly the size of the continental United States. That's when people talk about the Amazon, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a phenomenally huge area. The most of the Amazon, about 70% of the Amazon basin, is within the borders of Brazil. And in about 1970, the amount of forest cover that you had in the Brazilian Amazon was just over 4 million square kilometers. Okay, so that's a lot. And just since 1970, we're down to below that 4 million square kilometers. I mean, we have deforested to date somewhere around 20% of the Amazon.
20%.
Yeah, that's roughly the area of 2 states of California, more or less. Okay, so that's how much we've been cleared. Now, some of that is regenerated. Some of it is in various states of regeneration. But you also got to remember, I mean, we can't just be like, oh, it's coming back. I mean, these forests took millennia to grow. Some of these trees in the Amazon will be over 1,000 years old easily. So, you'll have, depending on the year, somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 square kilometers that are being cleared. I mean, it's just remarkable. And this doesn't even compare, you've got the other big, huge expanses of forest in the Congo. The highest rates of deforestation are actually in Southeast Asia. And that's because they've got the least rainforest left there, and clearing is proceeding so rapidly that in terms of the proportion of what's left, that is being cleared at a huge rate. So the scope of the problem is really huge, because we're not just studying deforestation because, it's one of these interesting topics that scientists get into. I mean, this is a huge and truly existential threat to the integrity of the world's ecosystems, human health, and human well-being, based on the ecosystem services that the Amazon provides: water, the regulation of the global climate cycle, critical food, medicine, economic support for the huge number of people who live in the Amazon and other rainforests, right? So understanding the consequences of deforestation, the drivers of deforestation, what happens to the species that persist following deforestation, and what we can do to regenerate the habitat that's been cleared and conserve what we've got is truly something that has existential implications for us as people.
Wow. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I've thought about some of these similar topics in agricultural systems, which is a different kind of fragmentation, I guess, and a different kind of system, because in many cases, the matrix, the impermeability of the matrix around islands is changing even within months based on the agricultural practices. But very interesting. I really appreciate you talking about all those things that you're really familiar with and work on down in the tropics. Is great information for us all to learn from. So thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get you back on here sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope to see anybody who's out there listening down in the rainforest someday. But hey, you know what? You don't have to get down to Brazil to see the rainforest. If you're drinking a cup of coffee or eating chocolate or taking medication to lower your blood pressure, the rainforest is there with you as well. And so we want to remind people of that. The things you do in your daily life affect that rainforest that you're carrying around with you no matter where you go. So Be mindful of that, and see you down in the forest.
Thanks for listening to How Ecology Works. If you're interested in more topics like this, follow us at ufdeerlab.